The hum of car engines and the glow of streetlights set the stage for an encounter that would change lives forever. A seemingly ordinary traffic stop on a bustling New York street spirals into a shocking confrontation when a young black woman is harassed and detained by an officer known for stepping beyond the law. Little does he know, the same woman he has treated with disdain will soon preside over his very fate in a courtroom. The moment she walks in wearing her judicial robes, everyone is left speechless. What unfolds next is a clash of justice, prejudice, and power. And karma is waiting in the wings. It was just past twilight in New York City, and the urban bustle had only shifted gears rather than died down. Workday traffic had ebbed, and a new flurry of nighttime activity began to fill the streets. Restaurants were opening their doors for late-night patrons. Neon signs flickered above windows, reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. The busy roads hummed with an ever-present symphony of horns and engines. Pedestrians weaved between the parked cars, and laughter mingled with distant sirens. In a small diner on the outskirts of Brooklyn, Officer Brian Callahan was finishing his routine coffee. He drummed his fingers on the counter, scanning the day's issue of the New York Times. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, Callahan had grown jaded after 2 decades on the force. His once idealistic sense of duty had curdled into something darker, an insidious habit of profiling, a cynical view of neighborhoods he believed to be trouble, and a quickness to flex his power. Sighing, he tossed the newspaper aside, draining the last of his coffee before heading back onto the streets. He paid the check, leaving a paltry tip. Outside, the glow of New York's skyscrapers disappeared behind a sprawling canopy of clouds. He tugged on his jacket, the crisp early autumn air nipping at his neck. He eased into his squad car, a sense of restlessness clinging to him. He was on the prowl, though not for criminals in the truest sense. He was scanning the streets for anyone who didn't belong. Meanwhile, across town, 29-year-old attorney Maya Caldwell navigated the streets after a late meeting with a local civil rights group. She had just been appointed as an interim judge 2 days earlier, an achievement that had filled her heart with a mixture of excitement and responsibility. She would be one of the youngest judges in Kings County history and the first black woman to take a seat in the newly established Community Integrity Court. Though her official swearing-in ceremony was still a week away, the legal world already buzzed with her name and formidable reputation in the courtroom. Maya was exhausted but energized by the possibilities her new position would bring. She had spent the evening discussing strategies to reduce recidivism rates in youth offenders. Now, she was winding her way back to her apartment on the Upper West Side. Her car glided easily through the traffic, an older Toyota Camry she'd maintained carefully since law school. She clicked on the radio, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel to the mellow strains of jazz. No one could have guessed that this very night, aimless for one, purposeful for the other, would end up shaping both of their destinies. Oblivious to the looming confrontation, Officer Callahan started his engine and flicked on his patrol lights, scanning the streets, itching for action. The clock on Maya's dashboard read 10:18 p.m. as she turned onto a street lined with old brick buildings, many of which had shuttered windows and tarnished signs from decades past. The area was known for its nightlife, but also for frequent police stops, especially of black drivers. Maya noticed a squad car in her rearview mirror. She wasn't speeding. All her lights were functioning properly. She had renewed her registration a month before. Still, she felt that familiar prickle of discomfort. She could not pinpoint why, but the tension in the air suddenly seemed heavier. Without warning, blue and red lights began to dance in her rearview mirror. The shriek of a siren cut through the hush of the night. Maya's stomach dropped. There was no immediate reason for her to be pulled over. She was simply heading home. Her heart hammered in her chest. Though she was a lawyer on the cusp of a historic judicial appointment, this moment triggered the same fear and frustration that so many people of color experience during traffic stops. Obediently, she flicked on her right turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road. She took a deep breath, mentally running through the standard protocol: keys out, hands visible, smile if you can manage it. Even as she reminded herself of these steps, her hands trembled slightly. She opened the glove compartment to retrieve her license, insurance, and registration. Officer Callahan sauntered up to her window, his gaze hard, his jaw set. Maya rolled down her window and offered a polite greeting, forcing a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "Good evening, officer," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Callahan leaned in, eyes flicking over her features and the interior of her car. "License and registration," he ordered curtly. She nodded, handing over the documents. Still, her sense of dread grew. "Of course. Here you go." He took them without a word, then disappeared back into his patrol car for what felt like an eternity. The clock on her dashboard now read 10:25. 5 minutes later, Callahan returned, his expression sterner than before. "You in a hurry, ma'am?" he asked, though his tone implied he already knew, or believed he knew, the answer. "Not particularly," Maya replied, holding his gaze. "Is something wrong?" His silence was thick. He stared at her as if challenging her to speak out of turn. She sensed a creeping hostility, something unwarranted and heavy in the air. "You made a wide turn back there," Callahan finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Maya's heart fluttered, but she maintained her composure. She knew her rights and the law. Still, stepping out of the vehicle, especially at night, on a nearly deserted street, with an officer whose body language screamed antagonism, that was a risk. "Officer, am I being detained?" she asked, careful to keep her tone polite but assertive. He stiffened. "Step out now." His request was forceful, and his hand hovered near his holster. Maya glanced around, empty sidewalks, dimly lit lamp posts. The nearest witness was a block away, a man who had just ducked into a convenience store. Her pulse raced. She weighed her options. Legally, the officer had not provided a valid reason for her to exit the vehicle, but she also recognized that noncompliance could escalate a bad situation into a catastrophic one. Reluctantly, she opened the door and stepped out. "What's your name?" Callahan asked, glancing at the license he had in his hand. "Maya Caldwell." "What are you doing out here this late?" She took a breath, fighting to keep her composure. "I'm returning from a meeting." "Is there a reason?" He cut her off, turning her around with a swift motion and pressing her against the hood of her car. "Spread your arms," he barked. She considered revealing that she was a lawyer, or that she was about to become a judge, but something told her it would do little good. The officer, emboldened by his own sense of power, would likely see it as a challenge. After finishing the search and finding nothing, Callahan spun her around to face him. His eyes seemed to be searching for signs of fear or submission, but Maya tried to stand tall, meeting his gaze head-on. "Got anything in the car I need to know about?" he asked, his voice thick with insinuation. "No," she responded firmly. He gestured to the passenger side. "Mind if I look?" "Do you have probable cause?" she asked carefully. "Because unless I'm being arrested, you don't have?" He sneered, taking her hesitation as a challenge. "Look, lady, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. I'll write you a citation for reckless driving, maybe resisting or interfering with an investigation. You want that?" Maya knew that if she refused, she might face hours of delay, or worse. She glanced around again for any sign of passers-by or cameras. She caught the faint glow of a security camera above the door of the convenience store a block away, but it was too far to capture details of her predicament. "Fine," she said under her breath. "Go ahead." Callahan pulled out a flashlight and began rummaging through her car. Maya stood by, arms crossed, anger bubbling in her chest. She listened to the sounds of him opening the glove compartment, rifling through the back seat, all in search of anything that could justify his aggression. When he found nothing, he returned, a smirk on his face. "You like giving cops a hard time?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Maya inhaled slowly. She was determined not to let fear show. "I'm simply exercising my rights, officer." He seemed to regard her for a moment with a mixture of annoyance and scorn. Then, with a curt nod, he handed back her license and registration. "Go on, get out of here," he said at last, a sneer curling his lip. "And watch your driving." Maya reclaimed her documents, her hand trembling slightly as she stuffed them into her purse. She climbed back into her car, shutting the door with more force than she intended. Her heart pounded, and her temples ached. She started the engine and pulled away, mindful not to look back in the mirror, though she knew Callahan was still standing there, watching her. Little did Callahan realize that he had just unlawfully detained a woman who, in less than a week, would wield a gavel with the power to decide his fate. Maya drove slowly through the next few blocks, taking deep breaths. When she stopped at a red light, a wave of nausea overtook her. The realization that this could have gone horribly wrong haunted her. She reached into the cup holder for her phone, debating whether to call the police station to file a complaint right away. But she also knew the complexities of such complaints, how often they were ignored, how the system sometimes protected its own. A million thoughts spun in her head. Should she tell her mentor, Judge Valerie Whitmore, about the incident? Should she contact someone at the civil rights group she had just met with? She could already hear them urging her to take immediate action, to set an example. But at that moment, she was exhausted, emotionally drained, and yearning only for the safety of her apartment. When she finally pulled into her parking garage, she noticed her hand was still shaking. She cut the engine, inhaled deeply, and leaned her forehead against the steering wheel. "You're safe now," she told herself. "It's over." But another voice inside her whispered, "Not for long." Officers like Callahan rarely stopped with one bad encounter. The memory of his sneer, the unmistakable prejudice in his eyes, stayed with her. He had humiliated her, detaining her on flimsy grounds, performing an invasive search, trying to intimidate her. The law clearly stated that such a stop was an overreach. Yet he had done it with brazen confidence. How many others had he done this to? She wondered. How many people ended up in jail because they didn't know their rights? She made her way up to her apartment, turned on a single lamp, and stood in the dim living room for a long moment. The space felt strangely unfamiliar. Tonight's event had cast a shadow over her sense of security. Eventually, she undressed, stepped into the shower, and let the hot water cascade over her. She closed her eyes, visualizing the upcoming days. Her official appointment as a judge would be announced at a small ceremony at the Kings County Courthouse next week. After that, she would preside over minor cases first, traffic offenses, community disputes, before moving on to more complex trials. Part of her dreaded stepping onto the bench with the fresh wound of tonight's trauma, but another part of her felt a flicker of resolve. She was in a position to make a difference. She had to use it. Officer Callahan had ended his shift and was sitting in his living room with a lukewarm beer in hand. A sports channel played on TV, but he scarcely paid attention. He was replaying the events of the night in his mind. Something about that woman had irked him. The calmness in her voice, the poised way she questioned him. She had looked at him, not with fear, but with indignation, and a certain self-assurance. He shrugged it off, telling himself he had done the right thing by pulling her over. He always convinced himself of his righteousness, even when his motivations were fueled by racial profiling. In his world, certain neighborhoods bred criminals, and certain people were more likely to be suspicious. He had told himself that for years, soaking up the toxic belief systems of a few like-minded colleagues, ignoring the moral voices of others on the force who tried to challenge him. "Probably some fancy college kid," he muttered under his breath, switching off the TV. "Thinks she can talk back to me because she knows her rights." He tossed the empty beer can in the trash, stumbled to his bedroom, and collapsed onto the bed. Tomorrow was another day of patrolling. One was haunted by the feeling of injustice. The other, by an uneasy irritation he couldn't quite name. She rose earlier than usual, determined to move forward. She decided to share what happened with a close friend, Detective Gabriela Martinez, a fellow woman of color who worked within the NYPD's Internal Affairs Division. Gabriela was someone Maya trusted wholeheartedly, a confidant who had seen her through law school woes and heartbreaks, and who deeply understood the complexities of law enforcement from the inside. They met at a quiet cafe near City Hall. Gabriela arrived in plain clothes, looking worn from a recent overnight shift. Still, her face lit up with concern when she saw Maya's tense expression. "May, you okay?" she asked, settling into the chair opposite her friend. Maya sipped her coffee, steadying herself. "I got pulled over last night, Gabriela, by an officer named Brian Callahan." Her voice was low but firm. "He basically had no grounds. He was extremely aggressive, Gabriella's jaw tightened. Callahan, she repeated. That name rings a bell. I've heard complaints, but nothing has stuck yet. Maya exhaled sharply. That's exactly the problem. Gabriella's expression darkened. I think there were some internal investigations a while back, she said, stirring her coffee absently, but they all got closed due to insufficient evidence. Maya exhaled sharply. That's exactly the problem, she murmured. These guys operate under the radar because no one can hold them accountable. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. I'm debating filing a formal complaint, but there's a lot going on. My new appointment, the public eye. I don't want it to become a distraction. Gabriella gave a wry smile. Or you don't want to paint a target on your back now that you're stepping into a high-profile role as a judge. Maya nodded reluctantly. That too. She sighed. But I also feel a responsibility. Callahan shouldn't keep doing this to people. If he felt free to do it to me, and I'm an attorney, can you imagine how he treats others who don't know how to push back? Gabriella reached across the table, resting a reassuring hand over Maya's. File the complaint, she urged. I'll keep my ear to the ground. But I understand if you want to wait until after your ceremony next week. You want to start off on the right foot, not mired in controversy. After a few moments, Maya murmured, Let me think on it. I'll keep you posted. For now, I just need to focus on the swearing in. My new responsibilities. Gabriella nodded. I get it. And hey, you know where to find me if you need backup. Maya smiled, feeling grateful for Gabriella's unwavering support. Maya found herself immersed in preparations. She met with court administrators, discussed upcoming cases, and tried to steel her nerves for the public ceremony that would cement her role as a judge. She ordered a new robe, carefully chosen to fit her small frame. She reviewed her docket, noting that her first day would involve several traffic and misdemeanor cases. A fitting start, she thought bitterly, after her own unjust traffic stop. During that time, Officer Callahan continued his regular patrols, untroubled and unaware of the significance of the name Maya Caldwell. He had encountered countless people like her, or so he told himself, each one just another notch in the belt. In his mind, certain demographics warranted suspicion, and it was his duty to keep the streets clean. Even a mild disagreement was proof enough that he had reason to suspect wrongdoing. The small courtroom in the Kings County Courthouse buzzed with excitement. Friends, family, and notable community leaders gathered to witness the official swearing-in of the county's newest judge. The ceremony had a warmth to it, tinted with a sense of history. Maya's parents sat in the front row, brimming with pride. Her mother dabbed tears from her eyes, while her father seemed to fight back a beaming grin. Judge Valerie Whitmore officiated the ceremony. Today, we welcome an exceptionally bright and compassionate legal mind to the bench, she announced to the assembled crowd. Maya Caldwell has demonstrated a commitment to justice and fairness throughout her career. We have no doubt she will continue to uphold these values in our court. The oath was brief but momentous. Maya repeated the words, her voice clear and steady. And then she felt the weight of the robe settle on her shoulders, a tangible reminder of her newfound authority and the responsibility that came with it. After the ceremony, she was embraced by a whirlwind of well-wishers. Colleagues from her law firm, old professors from her law school, community activists who had championed her appointment. She caught sight of Gabriella in the crowd, who gave her a broad smile and a subtle thumbs up. Maya mouthed a thank you, feeling an immense sense of gratitude, and also a small undercurrent of trepidation. This was the beginning of a new era for her, and she knew that the road ahead would be both exhilarating and fraught with challenges. Still, she was determined to carry her own experiences, both triumphant and painful, onto the bench. Maya sat in her judge's chambers, reviewing the docket for the day. A series of minor infractions and preliminary hearings filled the schedule. She brushed back a strand of hair and took a deep breath. While these cases might seem routine, for many defendants, it was their entire world on the line. She intended to give each one the attention it deserved. One by one, individuals filtered through the courtroom. There were traffic violations, petty theft charges, a few minor drug offenses. Maya listened intently, determined to make informed, compassionate decisions. Late in the afternoon, a new case was called. State of New York versus Officer Brian Callahan. Maya froze momentarily. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Her eyes darted down to the case file. It was a hearing for an alleged police misconduct complaint, escalated to a criminal charge. A defendant was accused of using excessive force during an arrest, and the matter had found its way onto Maya's docket because of scheduling shifts in the courthouse. Her breath caught in her throat. The name was the same, Brian Callahan, the officer who had stopped her on that deserted street. She stared at the file, struggling to maintain her composure. The prosecutor, a wiry man named David Lynn, approached the bench with a measured smile. Your Honor, this is a preliminary hearing for Officer Brian Callahan, who is accused of aggravated battery and misconduct while on duty. The alleged victim claims the officer used unnecessary force during a routine traffic stop, resulting in severe injuries. Maya's gaze flickered to the defense table, where Officer Callahan sat, looking uncomfortable, but defiant. He was dressed in a suit rather than his uniform, his expression guarded. He had yet to notice who was presiding. Time seemed to slow. Maya felt the memory of that night wash over her, the humiliation, the fear, and the seething anger she had suppressed. But now, she was no longer just a frightened citizen on the street. She was the judge, gavel in hand, entrusted with the power to interpret the law. She also knew there was a potential conflict of interest, legally and ethically. If she recognized Callahan as the officer who had stopped her, she might be compelled to recuse herself, to preserve the integrity of the court. But something in her hesitated. The question was, should she recuse herself immediately, or first ensure that this man, who appeared to be a repeat offender, was not allowed to slip through the cracks again? Her mind reeled. She had never expected to encounter him in her courtroom so soon. Then again, the city was large, but the legal community was smaller than people realized. The bailiff instructed the defendant to stand. Brian Callahan rose. Only then did he truly look at Maya. His eyes narrowed, confusion evident on his face. It was as though he recognized her, but couldn't fully place from where. Maya cleared her throat. Officer Callahan, she said, her voice even. You stand before this court for a preliminary hearing on charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct. This hearing will determine if there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Do you have counsel present? Callahan's attorney, a middle-aged man named Richard Cohen, stood. Yes, Your Honor. I represent Officer Callahan. We will be entering a plea of not guilty and will request an immediate review of the evidence. We believe the officer acted within the scope of his duties. Maya listened, nodding. Very well. The prosecution may proceed with an outline of the evidence and witness statements. Prosecutor David Lynn stepped forward, adjusting his tie. The victim, Mr. Malcolm Harris, alleges that Officer Callahan pulled him over for a broken taillight. Lynn began. What should have been a routine stop escalated when the officer used excessive force, resulting in Mr. Harris suffering a fractured arm. There are also claims of racial slurs used during the encounter. Lynn paused, then added, a bystander captured part of the incident on video. Maya's grip on her gavel tightened slightly. The similarities to her own experience sent a chill down her spine. Though her situation had not ended with physical harm, the victim's account was eerily familiar. Her gaze flickered toward Callahan. His expression remained stoic, but a flicker of apprehension crossed his features. She kept her face neutral, remembering her judicial training. Impartial, fair, objective. Defense counsel, she prompted. Cohen launched into an argument about how the traffic stop was justified, how the suspect allegedly resisted, how the officer used reasonable force. It was a polished defense, but Maya could sense the cracks. Yet the more she listened, the more aware she became that her role as the judge was about to become complicated, possibly compromised. She knew from her own personal knowledge that Callahan was not above making dubious stops, but she hadn't officially recused herself. She also recognized the ethical guidelines. Personal bias must not influence a judge's decision. At the conclusion of the hearing's initial statements, Maya took a measured breath. We will reconvene tomorrow to hear witness testimony and review any video evidence. Court is adjourned. The gavel sounded. Callahan's gaze lingered on her. Does he remember me? Maya wondered. She stood, stepping down from the bench with as much composure as she could muster. The bailiff escorted the defendant out, and the attorneys gathered their files. Maya retreated to her chambers, heart pounding. Maya's mind whirled. She knew the correct protocol might be to recuse herself, explaining that she had a previous encounter with the defendant. But she also knew that if she recused herself, the case might land in front of a judge less willing to question the defense's claims. Someone who might not see through the veneer of reasonable force. She picked up the phone and dialed Gabriella. "Hey," she began, forcing calm into her voice. "We need to talk." Gabriella arrived at her office, closing the door behind her. Maya explained the entire situation. How Callahan had just come before her bench. The charges of misconduct. The eerie echoes of her own experience. Gabriella pursed her lips. "Wow, that's complicated," she said softly. "You know the ethical guidelines. If you were a direct victim, you might have to recuse yourself. But also, your traffic stop was never documented as an official complaint." Maya nodded, staring at the file on her desk. "Yes, but I was personally affected. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest?" Gabriella shrugged. "Legally? Maybe. Practically, though, consider what's best for justice. Some judges choose not to recuse themselves if the connection is tangential. And in this case, you were never involved in a formal investigation or listed as a complaining witness. You have no official connection to this case. It's just that you know in your heart who he is." Maya rubbed her temples. "It feels wrong to just ignore it. But at the same time, I can't stand the thought of him walking away scot-free again." Gabriella placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're the judge. You can ensure it's a fair process. You can ensure that the victim is heard, that the evidence is scrutinized properly." Then, after a pause, she added, "But no matter what, you have to uphold your duty to impartial justice. That means you can't let personal vengeance cloud your judgment." Maya nodded slowly. "I know you're right. I'll proceed carefully. If at any point I feel my personal history with Callahan is influencing my actions, I'll recuse myself and hand it over to another judge." Gabriella gave her a reassuring squeeze. "I'll keep tabs on the case from my end. Let me know if you need anything." After Gabriella left, Maya sat alone for a few minutes, reading over the case file again. The victim's testimony, the bystander's video, the corroborating statements. If everything panned out, it would be enough to move forward with charges against Callahan. But a hearing was only the beginning. A trial, if ordered, could take weeks or months. And defense attorneys had a knack for dragging out proceedings, hoping that witnesses would lose momentum, or that public scrutiny would wane. Finally, she gathered her resolve. "I won't let him slip through," she thought. "But I also won't violate my oath." The hearing resumed. The courtroom was hushed, and the tension was palpable. The prosecution presented a short, grainy cell phone video captured by a passerby. Though the footage was shaky, it showed Callahan slamming the victim against the hood of his patrol car and twisting his arm behind his back. The victim's cries of pain were audible. Officer Callahan's expression revealed flickers of unease, but he maintained a stoic front. His attorney challenged the video, claiming it didn't provide full context, that the victim was resisting, that no racial slurs were audible. When the victim, Malcolm Harris, took the stand, he recounted the incident in a trembling voice. He described how he was driving home from the grocery store, how Callahan pulled him over, how the officer's demeanor became aggressive when Malcolm questioned why he was being stopped. Malcolm's voice cracked as he described the pain in his arm, the fear he felt. Throughout the testimony, Maya maintained a neutral expression. But inside, she was boiling. How many times has this happened? How many people does Callahan victimize under the color of law? Callahan took the stand. He claimed Malcolm had reached for something in the car, that it might have been a weapon, that he had to use force to protect himself. Maya watched him carefully. His words rang hollow. He sounded rehearsed, like he had told this story before, over and over. Once the testimony was complete, Maya retreated to her chambers to deliberate on whether there was probable cause to proceed to trial. The burden at this stage was not to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but merely to establish enough evidence that a reasonable jury could find Callahan guilty if the allegations were proven in full. She took a few deep breaths. This was where her conscience and her duty intersected. If she dismissed the case, Callahan would walk. If she ruled there was enough cause, the matter would move to a higher court for a full trial. I must base this on the evidence, she reminded herself, not my personal bias. The evidence is substantial. The video, the victim's testimony. Eventually, she emerged and took her seat on the bench. Callahan and his attorney looked on. It is the finding of this court, she began, her voice steady, that sufficient evidence exists to proceed with the charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct against Officer Brian Callahan. The case will move to trial, pending scheduling and assignment to a trial court. She could see Callahan's lips tighten in anger. She also saw a flash of recognition in his eyes, as though a puzzle piece had clicked into place. He knew who she was now. This hearing is concluded, she said, tapping the gavel lightly. Callahan's attorney quickly requested a sidebar, but she waved him off, stating that any further motions should be filed in writing. She stood, stepping away from the bench. The bailiff called for order as everyone rose. Maya felt a rush of adrenaline. She had done it, followed the evidence, adhered to the law, refused to let fear sway her. But she knew this was only the beginning. A clerk tapped on Maya's chamber door with unexpected news. The trial court assignment had been expedited due to recent backlog shifts. Through the random assignment process, the case was still slated to remain under her jurisdiction. It meant that she would preside over Callahan's trial. This was highly unusual, but not impossible in a system stretched thin by an overload of cases. Maya swallowed. This was far more significant than a preliminary hearing. A full trial would mean weeks of proceedings, witness testimonies, cross-examinations, continuous direct interaction with Callahan, who now, undoubtedly, recognized her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Gabriella. "He knows who you are. Be careful." Maya locked the phone, her mind racing. She had to decide whether to accept the assignment or formally recuse herself. However, if she recused herself now, it might be viewed as suspicious or potentially manipulative. The case was high-profile enough that the local media had started to pay attention. The New York Times had an article in the works about alleged police misconduct. If she stepped away without a clear reason, it could cause speculation. If she stayed on, Callahan's defense might claim bias if they learned about her personal experience. She scheduled an urgent meeting with Judge Valerie Whitmore, her mentor. The wise, seasoned judge listened intently to Maya's predicament, nodding occasionally. When Maya was done, Judge Whitmore offered careful counsel. "This is a tricky position, Maya," she said, tapping a pen against her desk. Judges recuse themselves if there's a conflict of interest that could prevent them from being fair. You do have a personal history with the defendant, but no official complaint was ever filed. Technically, there's no legal record that ties you to him. Maya rubbed her temples. But ethically, I know what he did to me. I experienced his harassment firsthand. Judge Whitmore nodded. Yes, and that complicates matters. The real question is, can you still be impartial? If you believe you can weigh the evidence fairly, without letting your personal feelings sway you, you might remain. On the other hand, if you feel you can't, the right thing is to step aside. Maya inhaled deeply. He's a menace, Valerie. This might be one of the few opportunities to hold him accountable. Judge Whitmore reached out, resting a hand on Maya's. Remember, your role is to ensure justice is served, regardless of personal feelings. If the case is strong, the jury will convict, assuming it goes to trial. And if the evidence is lacking, the defense might prevail. Your job is to ensure a fair trial. That's it. After a prolonged pause, Maya nodded. I'll see this through, as long as I can uphold my duty. If at any point I feel compromised, I'll recuse myself. Judge Whitmore gave her a small, encouraging smile. Good. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, community activists, curious onlookers. Officer Callahan arrived in a tailored suit. His features hardened. His attorney looked smug, likely expecting to skew the prosecution's witnesses. Prosecutor David Lynn started with an impassioned opening statement, detailing the evidence against Callahan, the video, medical records of Malcolm Harris's injuries, an eyewitness account, He painted a picture of an officer abusing his power, targeting vulnerable citizens, then covering it up with routine reports. The defense countered, insisting that the prosecution's narrative was sensationalized, that Callahan was acting in good faith, that the witness was unreliable, the video inconclusive, the victim prone to exaggeration. Maya oversaw the proceedings with measured composure. She ensured that both sides followed procedural rules, admitted valid evidence, refrained from inflammatory rhetoric. The jury, a diverse group selected through vigorous voir dire, listened intently. Some took notes, clearly disturbed by the video footage, while others appeared skeptical. The prosecution introduced previous complaints, though never substantiated, allegations of excessive force, racially biased policing. Callahan's attorney objected, citing irrelevance, but Maya allowed limited reference, stating that it spoke to a possible pattern of behavior. The tension in the room heightened when the eyewitness, a young man named Isaiah Turner, took the stand. He described standing on the sidewalk, watching the arrest unfold. He claimed he heard Callahan call Malcolm a worthless thug, and told him he was lucky to make it this far. The defense tried to discredit Isaiah, bringing up his own minor criminal record, but Maya permitted only limited questioning on that subject. Every day, Maya went home feeling emotionally drained. She meticulously compartmentalized her personal history with Callahan, focusing only on what transpired in the courtroom. She took solace in the fact that no one else knew about her encounter, except Gabriella and Judge Whitmore, both of whom trusted her to handle the situation ethically. The moment of reckoning. Eventually, the defense called Callahan to the stand. He testified that he suspected intoxication, claimed Malcolm reached for something in the glove box, that he had no choice but to use force. Maya watched him carefully. His words rang hollow. He sounded rehearsed, as though reciting a well-practiced speech. The prosecutor hammered Callahan with details from the cell phone video. "You are seen twisting Mr. Harris's arm even after he was subdued. How do you explain that, Officer Callahan?" Callahan shifted. He was resisting, but there's no audio evidence that he was resisting. The prosecutor pressed. In fact, the video clearly shows him crying out in pain, pleading for you to stop. Callahan's mouth set in a grim line. "I used the force necessary to protect myself." The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. The jury watched, taking in every word. Maya kept her expression neutral, but inside, she knew. This was it. The final blow came when the prosecutor brought out the official police report. In it, Callahan claimed that Malcolm lunged at him. Yet, the video showed no such movement. It was a clear discrepancy. Callahan stumbled over his explanation, claiming the report was rushed, that the movement was subtle, that the camera angle was deceptive. The more he spoke, the more he seemed to trap himself in contradictions. The defense, clearly rattled, offered a brief redirect, trying to salvage Callahan's credibility. Maya maintained order, ensuring the rules of evidence were followed, but she allowed the defense enough latitude to make their case. She would let the jury decide, as was her duty. Prosecutor David Lynn appealed to the jury's sense of justice. This case is about an officer who has taken it upon himself to profile and brutalize citizens under the pretense of law enforcement. The evidence speaks for itself. The inconsistent police report, the video footage, the witness testimony. Officer Callahan violated his oath, and Mr. Harris paid the price. In contrast, the defense insisted the prosecution had spun a sensational tale, that the dangers of police work were being ignored. Don't let biased media or incomplete video footage sway you. Officer Callahan was doing his job under challenging circumstances. The jury deliberated for hours, then days. Tension in the courthouse was palpable. Media waited outside for any scrap of information. Inside, Maya was a bundle of nerves beneath her calm exterior. She knew the evidence was strong, but juries could be unpredictable, especially in cases involving the police. Finally, the jury sent a note. "We have reached a verdict." The courtroom was packed for the reading. Callahan's face was rigid, beads of sweat dotting his brow. The court clerk stood. The foreperson of the jury passed a slip of paper into his hands. Maya addressed the jury. "Have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor." "Guilty." A hushed gasp ran through the room. Maya watched Callahan's expression twist, in shock and fear. "Guilty." Callahan stiffened. His attorney looked grave. Maya let the verdict settle. Then, quietly, she dismissed the jury. She asked the prosecution and defense to approach for sentencing schedules. The entire time, Callahan stared at her. With a mixture of disbelief and growing rage, Maya looked at him. In her eyes, there was no triumph, just a solemn commitment to justice. She believed the jury had made the right decision, based on the evidence presented. Outside the courthouse, a barrage of reporters gathered, clamoring for statements. Prosecutor Lynn briefly addressed them, hailing the verdict as a step toward accountability. The defense attorney rushed Callahan away, refusing to comment. But pictures snapped, images that would fill headlines the next day. Officer found guilty of excessive force in high-profile trial. Callahan was suspended from duty, pending sentencing. He was out on bail for the time being, but faced the prospect of prison. The biggest shock for Callahan was still to come. During the sentencing hearing, as he stood before Judge Maya Caldwell,